The hum of Stanton International Airport pulsed through the terminal like a living thing. A chaotic symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and muffled announcements echoing off the glass walls. It was just another evening flight, one of countless others, but something electric hung in the air, something no one could name yet. Amid the sea of travelers, Victor Hensley emerged, a wiry figure at 68, his silver hair swept back neatly, his frame draped in a threadbare coat that seemed older than the man himself. Each step he took was slow, deliberate, his slightly trembling hand clutching a weathered leather briefcase, a relic that carried more weight than anyone could guess. To the untrained eye, he was just another elderly passenger, blending into the crowd like a shadow. But Victor Hensley was no ordinary man, and this flight was about to become anything but ordinary. At the boarding gate, the line stretched long and restless, passengers jostling to escape the terminal's chaos. Victor approached the document check, his pale blue eyes catching the dim light as he offered a faint, courteous smile to the uniformed staff. Lydia Voss, a 28-year-old flight attendant with sharp features and sharper impatience, stood behind the counter, her name tag glinting under the fluorescent glow. She barely glanced at him, her fingers snapping out like a whip. "Passport and boarding pass," she barked, her voice slicing through the hum of the crowd. Her eyes flicked past him before he could even respond, already dismissing him as insignificant. Victor handed over his documents, his hands trembling just enough to betray his age, but Lydia didn't notice or didn't care. She scanned them with a flick of her wrist, her lips curling into a faint sneer. "Economy," she muttered, shoving the papers back at him as if they'd wasted her time. "Move along." Victor nodded silently, his slow shuffle carrying him toward the jet bridge, the metal ramp clanging softly under his worn shoes. Behind him, the bustle of the gate faded, but the weight of Lydia's disdain lingered like a splinter under his skin. He didn't react, not yet. He never did, not until the moment was right. As he stepped into the narrow aisle of the plane, the cabin buzzed with pre-flight energy. Passengers cramming bags into overhead bins, children whining, a young couple brushing past him without a second glance. Victor's eyes scanned the seat numbers, his pace steady but unhurried, until he reached his row. He paused, lifting his briefcase with careful effort, the leather creaking as his fingers tightened around the handle. That's when it happened. Lydia Voss stormed down the aisle, her heels clicking like gunfire on the floor. She'd spotted him from the front of the plane, her sharp eyes narrowing at his slow movements. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she snapped, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "You're holding everyone up." Before Victor could respond, she lunged forward, snatching the briefcase from his grip with a force that sent a jolt through his frame. "Give me that, I'll do it," she hissed, yanking the bag toward the overhead bin. In her haste, the clasp popped open, and a small stack of papers fluttered out, scattering across the aisle like fallen leaves. Victor froze, his breath catching as one sheet landed facing a glimpse of something official, something important, though no one could read it yet. "Colam Give?" Victor's voice cut through the air, low and steady, but with an edge that made the hairs on Lydia's neck prickle. She froze mid-motion, the briefcase still half-shoved into the bin. "Those are mine," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "Pick them up. Now." For a split second, Lydia's confidence faltered, her eyes darting to the papers on the floor. Then she laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in the suddenly quiet cabin. "Don't make a scene, old man," she said, scooping the papers up carelessly and cramming them back into the bag. "It's just paper. Relax." She slammed the bin shut with a bang, brushing her hands off as if she just handled something dirty. Around them the air shifted. James Carver, a 43-year-old businessman in a crisp suit, leaned forward in his seat a few rows back, his brow creasing as he watched the exchange. Clara, a 67-year-old woman with a gentle face, whispered to her husband beside her. That was uncalled for. Even Miles Carter, a 27-year-old flight attendant with a warm smile, hesitated near the galley, his instincts urging him to step in. But Lydia didn't notice the eyes on her, didn't feel the ripple she just set in motion. To her, Victor was a nobody, just a frail, slow-moving irritation in economy class. She turned on her heel, her posture rigid with authority, and strode back toward the front of the plane, leaving Victor standing there, his hands empty, his gaze fixed on her retreating figure. The plane climbed steadily into the night sky, its engines humming a low, relentless tune that vibrated through the cabin walls. The overhead lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, casting long shadows across the rows of passengers settling into their seats. For most, it was the start of a routine flight, headphones on, screens flickering to life, the occasional rustle of a magazine. But beneath the surface calm, a fault line was forming, one that split the cabin in two. And at its center stood Lydia Voss, oblivious to the fracture she was deepening with every step. Up in first class, Lydia transformed. Her sharp edges softened, her clipped tone melted into something warm and syrupy as she glided between the plush seats. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she purred to a man in a tailored suit, adjusting his pillow with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She refilled a woman's champagne glass with a delicate tilt of the bottle, her posture poised, her voice a velvet whisper. "Just let me know if you need me," she said, lingering a moment longer than necessary, basking in the glow of their appreciative nods. To them, she was the picture of professionalism, attentive, charming, indispensable. It was a performance she'd perfected over years, one that earned her nods of approval and the quiet satisfaction of being in control. But the moment she stepped past the curtain into economy, the mask slipped. Her heels clicked harder, her shoulders stiffened, and that artificial warmth vanished like smoke in the wind. She moved briskly down the aisle, her eyes scanning the rows with thinly veiled impatience. A young mother struggled to calm her fussing toddler. Lydia didn't stop. An elderly man fumbled with his seatbelt, barely glanced his way. And then there was Victor Hensley, seated quietly by the window, his hands folded in his lap, his weathered face turned toward the endless stretch of clouds outside. To Lydia, he was still just the slow old man from boarding, a minor irritation she'd already dismissed. She didn't see the way his fingers brushed the armrest, steady and deliberate, or the faint flicker of something unreadable in his pale blue eyes. James Carver noticed, though. From his seat a few rows back, the 43-year-old businessman adjusted his glasses, his sharp gaze tracking Lydia's every move. He'd seen her type before, people who wore authority like a badge, doling out respect only where they thought it was owed. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as Lydia snapped at a passenger trying to stow a bag. "She's a different person back here." Beside him, Clara, a soft-spoken woman of 67, leaned toward her husband, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see how she treated that poor man earlier? Snatching his things like that, it's disgraceful." Her husband nodded, his eyes flicking toward Victor. "She's got no patience for anyone who doesn't fit her mold." Miles Carter, the 27-year-old flight attendant with a kinder soul, felt it too. From his spot near the galley, he watched Lydia breeze past Victor's row without so much as a glance. He'd seen the incident at boarding, the way she'd yanked Victor's briefcase, the papers fluttering to the floor, the cold indifference in her voice. It gnawed at him, a quiet unease that tightened his jaw. "Need anything, sir?" he asked softly as he passed Victor's seat, pausing just long enough to catch the older man's eye. Victor turned his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not yet," he replied, his voice low but clear, carrying a weight Miles couldn't quite place. "But thank you." Miles nodded and moved on, but something lingered, a hunch, a whisper of instinct that this man wasn't what he seemed. Lydia, meanwhile, was already back in her element, pushing a beverage cart through first class with a flourish. "Champagne? Coffee?" she offered, her tone lilting as she catered to every whim. A woman in a silk scarf complimented her efficiency. A businessman flashed a grin as she handed him a napkin with a flourish. She soaked it in, her confidence swelling with every nod of approval. But when the cart rolled into economy, her demeanor shifted again, brisk, mechanical, detached. "Water or juice?" she barked at a teenage girl, barely waiting for an answer before shoving a cup into her hand. When she reached Victor's row, she didn't even stop. "You'll have to wait," she said over her shoulder, her voice dripping with irritation as if his very presence offended her. Victor didn't flinch. He didn't call after her or demand attention. He simply watched, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, his gaze steady and unflinching. If Lydia had bothered to look back, she might have noticed the way the cabin had begun to shift, how eyes followed her now, not with indifference but with quiet judgment. James scribbled a note in the margin of his newspaper, his lips pressed into a thin line. Clara whispered again to her husband. She's digging her own grave, isn't she? And Miles, stacking trays in the galley, glanced toward Victor with a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something bigger than Lydia's petty power plays. The divide was widening, a chasm carved by every cold glance, every snapped word. Lydia Voss strutted through the cabin, convinced she held the reins, blind to the fault lines cracking beneath her feet. She didn't know it yet, but the man she'd dismissed, the man whose papers she'd carelessly scattered, wasn't just watching her. He was waiting. And as the plane soared higher into the night, the tension coiled tighter, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The storm was coming, and Lydia was walking straight into its eye. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the hum of the engines blending with the soft murmur of passengers lost in their own worlds. Overhead screens glowed with movies, trays clicked into place, and the faint scent of coffee drifted from the galley. But beneath this thin veneer of normalcy, a storm was brewing, a slow, simmering tension that coiled tighter with every passing minute. At the heart of it sat Victor Hensley, his silver hair catching the dim light, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. To the untrained eye, he was just an old man gazing out at the clouds, lost in thought. But Victor wasn't lost. He was waiting, and his patience was a blade, sharp and silent, poised to strike. Lydia Voss moved through the aisle like a general on patrol, her heels striking the floor with crisp precision. She just finished charming her way through first class, leaving behind a trail of satisfied smiles and empty champagne flutes. Now, back in economy, her demeanor hardened again, her eyes darting over the rows with a mix of boredom and disdain. She paused near the galley, tugging at her uniform as if it could erase the inconvenience of dealing with these people. Miles Carter stood nearby, wiping down a counter, his warm brown eyes flicking toward her with quiet disapproval. "You could at least pretend to care," he muttered under his breath, low enough that she didn't hear or chose not to. Then Victor shifted. It was subtle, just a slight turn of his head, a faint creak as he leaned forward in his seat, but it caught Lydia's attention like a moth to a flame. His voice, low and steady, cut through the cabin's hum. "Miss Voss," he said, his tone carrying an authority that belied his frail frame. "I'd like my briefcase back." The request hung in the air, simple yet weighted, a quiet command that demanded a response. Lydia froze mid-step, her head snapping toward him. For a moment, her mask-slip surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by irritation. "Your briefcase," she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "It's fine where it is. Sit down." Victor didn't flinch. His pale blue eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, and the air between them thickened. "I wasn't asking," he said, his words slow and deliberate, each syllable landing like a stone in still water. "Those papers you scattered, they're important. I need them now." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a ripple of curiosity spread through the rows. James Carver set his newspaper down, his brow arching as he leaned forward. Clara gripped her husband's arm, whispering, "He's not backing down." Even Miles paused, his rag still in hand, watching the scene unfold with a mix of awe and apprehension. Lydia's lips twisted into a sneer, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes, something she couldn't quite suppress. "Important," she scoffed, stepping closer to Victor's row, her voice rising just enough to draw more attention. "What could you possibly have in there that's so important?" "Tax returns from the last century." A few passengers chuckled nervously, but the sound died quickly under the weight of Victor's gaze. He didn't rise to her bait. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his hands folding in his lap, his expression unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, so softly it was almost a whisper, yet it carried a chill that made Lydia's smirk falter. She recovered fast, though too fast. "Fine," she snapped, spinning toward the overhead bin. "If it'll shut you up, I'll get your precious bag." She yanked the bin open with a dramatic flourish, her movements sharp and impatient. The briefcase teetered on the edge, and for a split second, it looked like it might fall again, just as it had during boarding. Lydia grabbed it roughly, thrusting it toward Victor with a glare. "Here. Happy now?" The papers inside shifted audibly, a faint rustle that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Victor took the bag without a word, his fingers brushing the worn leather as he set it on his lap. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but laced with something darker, something that made Lydia's jaw tighten. She didn't walk away immediately. She stood there, arms crossed, staring down at him as if daring him to say more. "You know," she said, her voice low but cutting, "people like you slow everything down. Next time, check that thing if it's so important." Victor didn't respond. He simply opened the briefcase a crack, his eyes flicking to the papers inside crumpled, yes but intact. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "People like me," he repeated, almost to himself. Interesting choice of words. The exchange hadn't gone unnoticed. James muttered to himself, "She's poking a bear and doesn't even know it." Clara's husband nodded, his voice hushed. "He's too calm, too controlled. She's in trouble." Miles stepped forward, sensing the tension spiraling out of control. "Lydia," he said quietly, "let's move on. We've got service to start." But Lydia waved him off, her eyes still locked on Victor. "No, Miles, I'm done babysitting." He's got his bag, let's see if he can manage not to drop it this time. She turned on her heel and stormed back toward the galley, her confidence intact but brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. Behind her the cabin buzzed with whispers, low, urgent, electric. Victor closed the briefcase with a soft click, his fingers lingering on the clasp. He wasn't angry, not visibly. He didn't need to be. Every word Lydia had thrown at him, every jab and sneer, was a thread she'd unwittingly handed him, threads he'd weave into something she couldn't escape. The storm was still distant, but its shadow loomed closer now, and Victor Hensley sat at its center, calm, quiet, and utterly unshaken. The plane droned on through the night, a metal bird slicing through the endless dark, its cabin wrapped in a deceptive calm. Passengers dozed or tapped at screens, the soft clink of cups and rustle of blankets masking the tension that had been building since takeoff. But the air felt charged now, heavy with anticipation, as if the aircraft itself knew something was about to erupt. Victor Hensley sat still, his briefcase resting securely on his lap, his fingers tracing its worn edges with a quiet precision. Lydia Voss had underestimated him, mocked him, dismissed him, and he'd let her. Until now. It started with a jolt. The plane lurched suddenly, a violent shudder that ripped through the cabin like a gunshot. Overhead bins rattled, trays clattered, and a chorus of gasps filled the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but clipped, "we're hitting some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The words barely settled before another jolt struck, sharper this time, sending a child's toy skittering down the aisle. Passengers clutched armrests, their eyes wide with panic, but Victor didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the window, calm as ever, even as the storm outside mirrored the one brewing within. Lydia sprang into action, her heels pounding the floor as she rushed down the aisle barking orders. "Belts on! Now!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. She reached Victor's row and paused, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the briefcase still on his lap. "Put that under your seat," she demanded, her tone sharp enough to slice steel. "It's a safety hazard." Victor turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze with that same unyielding stillness. "It's fine where it is," he said, his voice low but firm, a rock amid the rising tide of her frustration. "Fine." Lydia's laugh was short and bitter, drowned out by another lurch of the plane. "You don't get to decide what's fine." She lunged forward, reaching for the briefcase with the same reckless impatience she'd shown at boarding. But this time Victor's hand shot out, clamping onto the handle with a strength that belied his age. "Don't," he warned, his voice a quiet thunder that stopped her cold. For a moment they were locked in a silent standoff, her hand hovering, his grip unyielding until the plane bucked again, harder than before. The overhead bin above Victor's seat popped open with a bang, and chaos erupted. Bags shifted, a water bottle tumbled out, and then inevitably the briefcase slipped from their tug-of-war, crashing to the floor. The clasp, already weakened from Lydia's earlier mishandling, gave way and papers spilled across the aisle like confetti in a hurricane. A single sheet fluttered upward, caught in the draft, and landed face up under the cabin's dim lights. Time seemed to slow as eyes darted toward Edith's sleek, embossed card glinting with the airline's logo and the words, Victor Hensley, chairman of the board. A hush fell over the cabin, sharp and electric, broken only by the creak of the plane as it steadied. James Carver leaned forward, his jaw dropping as he read the card. No way, he breathed, a grin tugging at his lips. Clara clutched her husband's arm, her voice trembling with disbelief. He's the owner? Whispers exploded like wildfire, racing from row to row, a tidal wave of shock and realization. Miles Carter, bracing himself against the galley wall, stared at the card, then at Victor, his hunch from earlier snapping into focus. I knew it, he muttered, shaking his head. Lydia stood frozen, her hand still outstretched, her face draining of color as the truth hit her like a freight train. The old man she'd mocked, the one she'd treated like a nuisance, wasn't just a passenger. He was the man who owned the airline, her airline. Her breath hitched, her eyes darting from the card to Victor, who hadn't moved an inch. He reached down calmly, retrieving the card with a steady hand, and tucked it back into the briefcase. You should have listened, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed in her ears louder than the turbulence outside. The plane rocked again, but no one cared about the storm beyond the windows anymore. All eyes were on Lydia, pinned under the weight of 100 stares, some stunned, some smug, some outright furious. James chuckled darkly. She's done for. Clara whispered to her husband. She had it coming. Miles stepped forward, his voice low but firm. Lydia stepped back. Now. But she couldn't move, couldn't speak, her world unraveling thread by thread as the reality sank in. Then the intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Hensley, sir, this is Captain Reynolds. We've just received word from headquarters they've identified you on board. On behalf of the crew, I apologize for any inconvenience. The words landed like a hammer, shattering what little composure Lydia had left. Victor didn't acknowledge the apology. He simply looked at her, his pale blue eyes piercing through her defenses. I don't need apologies from him, he said, his tone cold and deliberate. But you, Miss Voss, you'll be hearing from the board. The storm had broken, not in the sky but right there in the cabin. The turbulence outside was nothing compared to the chaos Lydia had unleashed upon herself. Victor Hensley sat back, the briefcase secure once more, his calm unshaken even as the plane steadied. Around him the whispers grew louder, the stares sharper, and Lydia stood alone in the wreckage of her own making, the first cracks of her downfall splitting wide open. The turbulence faded as quickly as it had struck, leaving the plane gliding smoothly through the night sky once more. The cabin lights flickered back to a steady glow, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom urging calm. We're through the worst of it, folks. Please remain seated as we prepare for our final approach. But the storm inside the aircraft was far from over. It had only just begun. The air buzzed with a new kind of energy, sharp and relentless, as passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances and hushed whispers. Victor Hensley's identity had ripped through the cabin like lightning, and now all eyes turned to Lydia Voss, the woman who'd lit the fuse without even knowing it. Lydia stood rooted in the aisle, her outstretched hand still hovering where the briefcase had slipped from her grasp. Her face was a mask of pale shock, her lips parted but silent, as if the words she'd wielded so carelessly had abandoned her. The card Victor Hensley, chairman of the board, burned in her memory, each letter a dagger twisting deeper into her chest. She'd mocked him, dismissed him, treated him like dirt under her polished heels, and now the truth loomed over her like a tidal wave she couldn't outrun. Victor sat calmly in his seat, the briefcase back in his lap, his fingers brushing its surface with a quiet dignity that made her squirm. He didn't need to say another word. His silence was condemnation enough. Around her, the cabin came alive with judgment. James Carver leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched her unravel. She's about to learn a hard lesson, he muttered, his voice low but laced with satisfaction. Clara, clutching her husband's hand, shook her head in quiet outrage. She had no right treating him like that, none at all. Her husband nodded, his eyes flicking to Victor. He didn't even raise his voice. That's real power. Miles Carter stepped closer, his expression torn between pity and frustration. Lydia, he said softly, his voice a lifeline she didn't deserve. "You need to sit down. This isn't going away." But Lydia couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her pulse hammering in her ears as Victor's earlier words echoed through her skull. "You'll be hearing from the board." She turned to him, desperation clawing at her throat. "Mr. Hensley," she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own panic. "Tu didn't know. I swear I didn't mean." Victor raised a hand, a small deliberate gesture that silenced her instantly. His pale blue eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, and there was no anger in them, no smugness, no glee, just a calm certainty that chilled her to the bone. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said, his tone even but piercing. "You chose how to treat me long before that card fell." The words landed like a slap, stripping away her excuses, her defenses, her fragile grip on control. She stumbled back a step, her hand grasping at the edge of a seat for balance. The passengers watched, their whispers growing bolder, sharper. "She's toast," someone murmured. "Serves her right," another voice added, tinged with disdain. Lydia's head spun, her breath coming in shallow bursts as the reality sank in. This wasn't just a bad shift or a passenger complaint she could brush off. This was the chairman, the man who held her career, her reputation, her entire world in his hands, and she'd humiliated him in front of everyone. Miles tried again, his voice firmer now. "Lydia, come on. You need to get to the galley now." She nodded mechanically, her body moving on autopilot as she turned away from Victor, her heels clicking unevenly against the floor. But every step felt like wading through quicksand, the weight of 100 stairs dragging her down. She reached the galley and sank against the counter, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge, her mind racing for a way out. "It's not that bad," she whispered to herself, a lie she couldn't even believe. "I can explain. I can fix this." But the truth gnawed at her. There was no fixing this. Not when the man she'd belittled owned the airline. Not when every passenger had seen it happen. Back in his seat, Victor adjusted the briefcase, his movements slow and methodical. He didn't gloat, didn't revel in her distress. He didn't need to. He'd spent decades in boardrooms, facing down louder egos and sharper tongues than hers, and he'd learned one unshakable truth. People revealed themselves when they thought no one important was watching. Lydia had shown exactly who she was: arrogant, dismissive, cruel, and now the consequences were hers to bear. He glanced out the window, the city lights glimmering faintly below, and a faint smile touched his lips. The plane was descending, and so was she. James caught the look and chuckled under his breath. "He's letting her hang herself with her own rope." Clara nodded, her voice soft but firm. She had every chance to do the right thing. Miles, still in the galley, watched Lydia with a heavy sigh. "You okay?" he asked, though he knew the answer. She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the floor, her knuckles white against the counter. The intercom chimed again. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The words jolted her, a stark reminder that time was running out. The reckoning had begun, and when those wheels touched down, it would only get worse. Victor leaned back, his hands resting atop the briefcase, his calm unshaken even as the plane dipped toward the runway. He hadn't demanded her punishment, didn't have to. Lydia had written her own fate with every cold word, every careless act, and now the board would finish what she'd started. The cabin lights brightened, the landing gear rumbled below, and Lydia Voss stood alone, her world teetering on the edge of collapse, with nowhere left to hide. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the wheels kissing the runway as the cabin swayed softly under the pull of deceleration. Outside, the city lights of the destination sparkled like a sea of stars, a dazzling welcome for most but not for Lydia Voss. For her, the landing wasn't an arrival, it was a descent into ruin. The intercom chimed overhead, the captain's voice smooth and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off. Thank you for flying with us." The words washed over the cabin, sparking a flurry of activity, passengers stretching, gathering bags, chatting in tired relief. But beneath the normalcy, a heavier silence lingered, thick with the aftermath of the storm that had broken mid-flight. Lydia stood in the galley, her back pressed against the cold metal counter, her hands still trembling as they clutched the edge. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority, felt like a straitjacket now, clinging to her sweat-damp skin. The words Victor Hensley had spoken, "You'll be hearing from the board," looped through her mind, each repetition tightening the knot in her stomach. She'd tried to convince herself it was salvageable, that she could talk her way out of this, but the weight of his calm, unyielding gaze crushed that hope. Miles Carter lingered nearby, his arms crossed, his expression a mix of resignation and quiet warning. "Lydia," he said, his voice low but firm, "you need to pull it together. They're coming." She didn't respond calmed. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, where the jet bridge loomed just beyond the open door. Through the narrow window she glimpsed them, two figures in crisp dark suits, flanked by a pair of uniformed security officers. They stood motionless, their silhouettes stark against the harsh terminal lights, waiting. Her breath caught, a shallow gasp that did nothing to steady her. "They," she whispered, more to herself than to Miles. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "The execs. They don't mess around when it's someone like him." Him. Victor Hensley. The man she'd mocked, the man whose briefcase she'd snatched, the man who owned everything she'd taken for granted. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft ding, and passengers surged to their feet, the cabin filling with the shuffle of bags and the murmur of voices. But their movements weren't aimless. Eyes flicked toward Lydia, some subtle, some brazen, all carrying the same unspoken verdict. James Carver slung his carry-on over his shoulder, pausing just long enough to mutter, "She's about to get what's coming." Clara and her husband moved slowly past, their faces set in quiet disapproval. "No one forced her to act like that," Clara said under her breath, her words a dagger Lydia couldn't unhear. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her, a suffocating tide she couldn't escape. Victor rose from his seat with the same deliberate calm he'd carried all along, his briefcase tucked under his arm. He didn't rush, didn't glance at Lydia, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command the cabin, a silent force that drew every gaze. As he stepped into the aisle, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his posture stiff with respect. "Mr. Hensley," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter, "the executive team is waiting to address your concerns. We'll ensure this is handled appropriately." Victor gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "I trust you will," he replied, his tone smooth but edged with steel. He moved toward the exit, each step a countdown to Lydia's unraveling. She couldn't stay in the galley any longer. Her legs moved on instinct, dragging her toward the front of the plane, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the noise around her. "Mr. Hensley," she called, her voice breaking as she stumbled into the aisle. He paused at the door, turning slightly, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Please, I didn't know. I'm sorry, But Victor raised a hand again, silencing her as effortlessly as he had before. "Apologies don't erase actions," he said, his voice cold and final. "You made your choices. Now live with them." He stepped onto the jet bridge, disappearing into the terminal, but his words lingered, a guillotine blade hovering above her neck. Lydia's knees buckled, her hand grasping the wall for support as the suited figures approached. The taller of the two, a man with sharp features and a name tag reading Thomas Klein, Senior Operations Director, stepped forward, his gaze icy. "Miss Voss," he said, his tone clipped and professional, "you're to remain on board. We need to discuss your conduct." Her mouth went dry, her tongue useless as she tried to form a response. "Two was following protocol," she stammered, but the lie sounded hollow even to her. The second executive, a woman with sleek black hair and a tablet in hand, tapped the screen and read aloud. "Multiple passenger complaints, crew observations and cabin footage confirm a pattern of unprofessional behavior specifically toward Mr. Victor Hensley." She looked up, her eyes piercing. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The word suspended hit Lydia like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs. "Footage," she croaked, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, his expression unchanging. "Every moment, your tone, your actions, your refusal to assist. It's all documented." Lydia's world tilted. The camerash forgotten the cameras. Every snap, every sneer, every time she'd brushed Victor off had been captured, a noose tightening around her career. Passengers streamed past, some whispering, some staring, their judgment now a chorus she couldn't silence. James shook his head as he exited. She dug her own grave. Clara's voice followed, soft but firm. Kindness costs nothing. Miles stepped up beside her, his hand hovering as if to steady her, but he pulled back. I tried to warn you, he said quietly, then turned and walked away. The jet bridge stretched before her, empty now except for the executives and security, their presence a wall she couldn't breach. Thomas spoke again, his voice cutting through her daze. You'll be contacted for the review. Don't leave the area. He turned away, the team retreating into the terminal, leaving Lydia alone in the doorway. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, an email. No doubt the suspension notice, but she didn't look. She couldn't. The city lights beyond the glass blurred as her vision swam, her chest tight with the crushing weight of it all. Victor Hensley was gone, but his shadow remained, and with it, the wreckage of everything she'd once been. The jet bridge stood eerily silent, a hollow tunnel of cold metal and harsh fluorescent light stretching between the plane and the terminal beyond. The last passengers had vanished into the bustling chaos of the airport, their footsteps and whispers fading into a distant hum. Lydia Voss remained alone, a ghost in her own story, her once crisp uniform now wrinkled and clinging to her trembling frame. The executive's words suspended, pending investigation echoed in her skull, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the world. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, the weight of unread emails pressing against her thigh, but she didn't reach for it. She couldn't. Not yet. The truth was too raw, too heavy, and it pinned her in place like a moth under glass. She sank against the jet bridge wall, her legs giving way as her back slid down the smooth surface. Her hands shook as they pressed against her face, muffling a ragged breath that bordered on a sob. Just hours ago, she'd strode through that cabin with unshakable confidence, her heels clicking with authority, her voice snapping orders like a whip. She'd believed herself untouchably a gatekeeper of the skies, deciding who deserved her time, her respect, her care. And Victor Hensley? To her, he'd been nothing, a frail old man in a worn coat, a nuisance slowing her down. She'd snatched his briefcase, mocked his requests, dismissed him without a second thought. Now that same man had walked away with everything she'd built, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. The terminal doors hissed open in the distance, letting in a gust of cool night air that brushed against her skin. She lifted her head, her vision blurry with unshed tears, and caught a fleeting glimpse of Victor Hensley disappearing into the crowd. He moved with the same steady grace he'd carried all along, his silver hair glinting under the lights, his briefcase tucked under his arm like a quiet extension of his power. He didn't look back, not once. He didn't need to. Passengers parted around him, some whispering, some staring in quiet awe, but he paid them no mind. Victor Hensley didn't demand attention. He commanded it effortlessly, a force that needed no words, no threats, no grand gestures. Lydia's chest tightened as she watched him go, a flood of memories crashing over her, every moment she'd misjudged, every chance she'd thrown away. She saw it all now, the way she'd rolled her eyes when he boarded, the sneer in her voice when she'd snatched his bag, the cold refusal to offer him even a shred of kindness. She'd thought power was in the rules she enforced, the control she wielded, the way she could make others bend to her will. But Victor had shown her something else. Something she'd never understood until it was too late. True power wasn't loud or brash. It didn't need to shout or prove itself. It waited, watched, and let the world reveal its own flaws. James Carver's voice drifted back to her from the cabin, a faint echo in her mind. She dug her own grave. Clara's words followed, soft but piercing. Kindness costs nothing. And Miles, poor patient Miles, his warning rang clearest of all. I tried to tell you. She dismissed them all, too caught up in her own arrogance to see the cliff she was racing toward. Now she stood at the bottom, broken and alone, her career in tatters, her name already a cautionary tale whispered among the crew. She could feel its story spreading like wildfire through the airport, the flight attendants' lounge, the training rooms. Don't be a Voss. Her stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat as the humiliation sank deeper. Her gaze drifted to the terminal, where Victor had vanished into the throng. He hadn't sought revenge, he hadn't needed to. He'd simply let her unravel, let her own actions weave the noose that now tightened around her neck. She thought of his final words on the plane. You made your choices. Now live with them. They weren't cruel, weren't spiteful, just a statement of fact. delivered with a calm that cut deeper than any insult could. And he was right. Every cold glance, every snapped word, every chance she'd had to do better, it had all been her choice. And now she'd live with the consequences, whether she wanted to or not. The jet bridge doors hissed shut behind her, sealing her off from the plane, from the life she'd known. Her phone buzzed again, another email. Another nail in the coffin, but she let it sit, untouched. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, and took a faltering step toward the terminal. The city lights beyond the glass glowed bright and indifferent, a world moving on without her. She'd spent the flight making Victor feel like nothing, stripping him of dignity with every careless act. Now, standing in the shadow of her own fall, she understood what that felt like. She wasn't Lydia Voss, senior flight attendant, anymore. She was no Onino job, no respect, no future in the skies she'd once ruled. As she stepped into the terminal, the noise of the airport swallowed her laughter. Announcements, the clatter of luggage wheels. A group of flight attendants passed by, their eyes flicking toward her before darting away, their whispers trailing in their wake. Lydia's shoulders slumped, her head bowing under the weight of their stares. She'd misunderstood power all along, chasing a hollow version of it while Victor wielded the real thing. Patience, dignity, the quiet strength to let others reveal themselves. He'd walked away unscathed, his lesson delivered without a single raised voice. And she? She'd fallen, not because he'd pushed her, but because she'd leapt headfirst into the abyss of her own making. The night air hit her face as she stumbled outside, the city stretching out before her, vast and uncaring. Her phone buzzed one last time, but she didn't look. She didn't need to. The lesson was clear, etched into her bones with a clarity she'd never escape. True power didn't need to prove itself, it simply was. And Lydia Voss, once so sure of her place, would spend the rest of her days learning what Victor Hensley had known all along. And so the tale of Victor Hensley and Lydia Voss fades into the night sky, leaving behind a wreckage of pride and a runway paved with lessons. Lydia stepped out into that cold city air, a shadow of the woman she'd been, while Victor walked off with the quiet dignity of someone who'd never needed to raise his voice to win. It's a story that feels almost too wild to be true, like something ripped from a viral X post or a late-night YouTube binge. But here's the kicker. It's not just a story. It's a mirror reflecting the little choices we make every day, whether we're on a plane, in an office, or scrolling through life in 2025. Think about it though, many times have we sized someone up based on their coat, their pace, their place in line? We've all had our Lydia moments, haven't we? Maybe not dragging a briefcase down an aisle, though if you have, please spill the tea in the comments, but dismissing someone because they didn't look important enough. Here's the hilarious truth. You never know when the guy you just snubbed at the coffee shop is secretly the CEO, or at least the one holding the last croissant. Life's got a wicked sense of humor like that. It loves to flip the script when you least expect it. So the next time you're tempted to flex your inner Lydia, maybe pause, sip your latte, and ask, what if this is my Victor Hensley moment? This isn't just about airplanes or arrogant flight attendants, it's about us. In a world where we're all rushing to prove something, Victor reminds us that real power doesn't need a megaphone. It's in the patience to wait, the grace to let others trip over their own egos, and the wisdom to know that kindness isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. Lydia learned that the hard way, and honestly, she's probably still Googling how to recover from public humiliation as we speak. Let's not join her in that search, yeah? So what about you? Ever had a Lydia moment where you misjudged someone and got a reality check? Or maybe you've been a victor, quietly proving a point without breaking a sweat? Drop your stories below, I'm dying to hear them. And if this tale of turbulence and triumph hit you right in the feels, don't forget to like, share, and smash that subscribe button. We've got more jaw-dropping stories coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss the next flight. Where are you watching from today? Your couch, your commute, or 30,000 feet in the air? Let's keep the conversation going.